The dust in that cellar hung in the air like it had been waiting for us, catching the thin beam of light sneaking through the floorboards while my heart pounded against the cold concrete. I could still feel the sting of Evan's betrayal on my back, the echo of the door slamming above us vibrating through my bones. If you've ever had the ground ripped out from under you by someone you love, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this have a way of finding the right ears. Down there, with Robert trembling beside me and the darkness pressing close, I realized this wasn't just a moment of fear. It was the moment everything started to unravel. I knew the sound of that lock clicking into place would stay with me for the rest of my life. One sharp scrape of metal, and suddenly I was standing in the dark cellar of the home I had loved for decades, trying to steady my husband as his weakened legs shook beneath him. The air felt colder down there, almost damp enough to cling to my skin. And for a moment I could hear nothing but his uneven breathing and my own pulse pounding in my ears. I kept replaying the sight of my son's face just moments before the door slammed. There was no softness left in him, none of the warmth I had held on to through every hard season of motherhood. What looked back at me was someone I barely recognized. Someone who had decided that pushing his parents into a cellar was easier than facing whatever resentment had been growing inside him. Fear came first, sharp and immediate, but it was the confusion that cut deeper. How had we reached a place where my own child could turn the key on us without hesitation? I wrapped my arm around Robert to keep him steady, forcing myself not to panic, not to crumble. He needed me grounded, even if everything inside me felt like it was cracking apart. Standing there in that darkness, I knew this moment didn't begin tonight. Something had shifted long before the lock turned. To understand how we ended up there, you have to know what life looked like before everything slowly unraveled. For most of my life, our home in Savannah felt like a living, breathing part of our marriage. Robert and I built our days around small routines that held us steady. Slow mornings on the porch, afternoons tending the garden he loved, evenings spent in the soft hum of a house that had sheltered us through every season. There was a warmth to those years that settled into my bones, a sense of belonging I never questioned. I thought that rhythm would carry us well into old age. But everything changed the morning Robert suffered his stroke. One moment he was standing beside me in the kitchen, and the next I was watching the life we knew slip through my fingers. Those first weeks were a blur of hospital rooms, whispered prayers, and the quiet terror of not knowing what our future would look like. When he finally came home, I devoted myself entirely to his care, grateful for every small sign of strength returning to him, even as fatigue worked its way deeper into my body. So when Evan and his wife Kara offered to move in and help, I felt a wave of relief. I told myself it was a blessing, that having family close would ease the weight on my shoulders. I welcomed them with genuine gratitude, believing their presence would restore balance to a world that had tilted overnight. At first, it seemed harmless. Their footsteps on the stairs, their voices drifting through the hallway, the subtle rearranging of spaces to suit their habits. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere of the house shifted. The warmth I had always felt began thinning at the edges, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Looking back, that was the beginning of it, the quiet unraveling I didn't yet recognize. And the longer they stayed, the more the house I knew started to feel like something entirely different. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, nearly invisible shift, the kind you only recognize in hindsight. At first, I simply noticed that the house no longer felt entirely mine. The rooms looked the same, the walls held the same memories, but the energy inside them had changed. It was as if the place had exhaled differently the moment Evan and Kara settled in. Small things went first. The quiet mornings Robert and I once shared were replaced by the sharp rhythm of Kara's heels moving across the hardwood. The scent of her perfume lingered in hallways where the smell of coffee used to greet me. Items I treasured, a framed photo, a worn throw blanket, little pieces of our history, were nudged aside to make room for things that matched her style more than ours. Each shift was subtle enough to dismiss, yet loud enough that I felt something tightening in my chest. Evan's distance grew even faster. He would pass through a room without looking at me, his attention swallowed by his phone or by the conversations he held quietly with Kara. It felt strange to stand beside the boy I had raised and sense him slipping further out of reach each day. There was a coolness in him I couldn't name, a kind of impatience that flickered every time I tried to bridge the space between us. Kara, meanwhile, expanded into the house with an ease that startled me. She moved through my kitchen as though it belonged to her, rearranging cabinets, adjusting routines, inserting her preferences without ever acknowledging what had existed before she arrived. Her dismissiveness wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Small looks, small sighs, small reminders that she thought my ways were outdated. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that they were only trying to help. But something inside me knew better. The tension was growing roots, deepening with every passing day, and before long it would push us toward a moment I could no longer ignore. It happened on a day that should have been ordinary. I had made lunch the way I always did, trying to keep some sense of normalcy alive. For a few quiet minutes, it almost felt like the house I used to know. But the moment Evan walked into the kitchen, that illusion cracked. There was a heaviness in his posture, a kind of practiced calm that made my stomach tighten before he even spoke. He eased into the topic as if it were nothing, as if asking me to hand over the house, the home Robert and I had built our lives in, was no more complicated than passing him a set of keys. I remember feeling my breath catch, not out of fear but disbelief. I waited for some sign that he understood what he was asking, that he felt the weight of it, but all I saw was expectation, as though my role in his mind had been reduced to clearing a path for his convenience. When I told him I couldn't do it, something in him hardened. The irritation I had sensed for weeks snapped forward, no longer masked by politeness. He spoke as if the house already belonged to him, as if my care for Robert, my years in this place, my entire life here were somehow secondary to whatever future he had imagined for himself. I watched the distance in his eyes turn into something sharper, something that made the room feel smaller. And when Robert appeared in the doorway, fragile but alert, I felt the atmosphere shift again, like a fuse had been lit. In that moment, I understood the truth I had been trying not to see. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was a line crossed, a danger rising. And it was only a matter of time before Evan acted on the anger simmering beneath his calm. The shove came so fast I barely had time to brace myself. One moment I was holding Robert's arm, trying to steady him, and the next we were stumbling down the steps into the storm cellar. The door slammed above us with a force that rattled the frame, and the sound of the lock sliding into place felt like a punch to the chest. For a heartbeat, I just stood there in the darkness, disoriented, listening to the echo of my own breath as it bounced off the cold concrete walls. The air was heavy down there, colder than I remembered, carrying the damp smell of earth that rose up from the floor. I guided Robert to the ground, my hands shaking as I tried to steady him. His body felt more fragile than ever, and seeing him curled in that dim corner broke something inside me. I could hardly make sense of what had just happened. My own son, my child, had turned a key to keep us trapped like we were nothing more than an inconvenience he needed out of the way. As I tried to calm my breathing, Robert leaned closer, his voice barely a strain of memory in my ear. He spoke of the far wall, of something hidden there, something he had hoped we would never need. Even in his weakened state, there was a flicker of urgency in him that cut through my shock. I looked toward the darkest end of the cellar, feeling dread twist into something sharper, something almost like purpose. Whatever waited behind that wall, I knew it was the only direction left to move. I moved toward the far wall with my hands stretched out in front of me, feeling my way through the cold, uneven surface. The cellar was silent except for Robert's strained breathing behind me, and every step felt heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was searching for, only that Robert's urgency had come from a place deeper than fear. When my fingers brushed over a stone that seemed slightly out of place, my heart kicked hard in my chest. It shifted under my touch, just enough to let a sliver of air escape from behind it. I pressed harder, and the stone slid inward with a low scrape. A hollow space revealed itself, and inside was a small metal tin, old, dented, and cold enough that it almost burned my palms when I lifted it out. I carried it back toward the sliver of light beneath the cellar door, my hands trembling as I opened the rusted latch. Inside were documents folded so delicately they felt like they could turn to dust. Birth records, legal papers, a letter written in a script I recognized from photographs of Robert's childhood. As I pieced together the meaning, my breath thinned. Robert had been adopted. His real father was a man whose name carried weight I had only ever heard whispered. A man with a history powerful enough and dangerous enough to change how people looked at anyone connected to him. I felt the shock ripple through me, not because Robert had kept this from me, but because of what it meant now. Evan had built his entire sense of identity on a legacy that wasn't truly his. He had wielded the Carver name like a shield, never knowing that the truth sitting quietly in my hands could shatter the illusion he depended on. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear, the hurt, the disbelief. They didn't disappear, but they loosened their grip. I wasn't powerless anymore. This secret, once meant to protect Robert, was now the key to protecting both of us. And as the first hint of resolve settled into my chest, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. It was time to take this truth out of the shadows and place it in the hands of someone who could help us reclaim our lives. By the time morning light slipped beneath the cellar door, the shock of the night before had hardened into something steadier. Evan and Kara had left in a rush, careless enough to forget the spare key sitting on the hallway table. With trembling hands, I reached under the door with a metal rod I found along the wall and dragged it close enough to grasp. The relief that washed over me when the lock finally clicked open felt almost unreal. I helped Robert up the stairs, each step a reminder of how much he had endured. Once he was settled safely in the guest room, I tucked the metal box into my bag, knowing that whatever path lay ahead began with the truth inside it. There was no room left for hesitation. Fear had carried me as far as it could. Hazel Monroe's office sat in a tall glass building downtown, its quiet halls humming with purpose. When she greeted me, her presence felt like an anchor, sharp-eyed, calm, unshaken by the weight I handed her. I watched her spread the documents across her desk, her expression shifting from curiosity to certainty. Through her measured words, I understood what the papers meant. The forged deed, the real lineage, the adoption records, all of it formed a shield stronger than anything Evan imagined we possessed. For the first time in months, I felt protected, not hidden, not silenced, protected. 2 days later, I stood at the end of the hallway as a courier handed Evan and Kara the eviction notice, their faces drained, disbelief turning to panic as reality settled in. The house, for once, felt still, waiting, and I knew this was only the beginning. The confrontation ahead would unravel everything they had built on lies. When I stepped into Evan's townhouse, the air felt thick with judgment. His relatives, a few neighbors, even 2 men I recognized as his business partners, all of them had been gathered to hear his version of the truth. I could feel the story he had spun settling over the room like a net, one that painted me as fragile, confused, unsteady. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the weight of it press against me. Evan tried to command the space, gesturing with the confidence of someone certain everyone already believed him. His tone carried that brittle edge I had learned to recognize, the one he used when he was performing. I could hear the suggestion in his voice that I was slipping, that age and stress had clouded my judgment. It stung more than I expected, even after everything. But Hazel stood at my side, calm and deliberate. I watched her place each document on the coffee table as if she were laying stones across a river, steady, undeniable, forming a path no one could ignore. The forged deed, the notary's statement, the neighbor accounts, the adoption papers, the lineage records, one after another. They broke apart the narrative Evan had built. I saw the shift ripple through the room, partners stiffening, relatives looking away, his own certainty cracking as the truth pulled the ground out from under him. By the time the last document was read, Evan wasn't performing anymore. He was unraveling, and in the quiet that followed, I finally felt the room see me, not as he had described me, but as I truly was. It was the beginning of the end, and in that silence, I knew the aftermath would change everything. When Evan and Kara finally left, the house exhaled with me. The quiet felt tender, almost new. Losing Robert not long after carved its own hollow place, yet I learned to fill it slowly with gentleness instead of fear. I turned that cellar into a sanctuary, a reminder that even the darkest spaces can become my own. Choosing myself was the lesson I should have honored sooner. If any part of my story speaks to something in your life, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here, and I would love to hear what this journey stirred in you.